So, hello, how is everyone doing? Great. So welcome all to Piper as we honor our third annual International Women's Day at the GSD and host our first panel ever as part of the GSD Public Lecture Series. We are proud to bring you programming that encourages conversation on gender parity within society through the lenses of policy, art, and architecture. As you may or may not know, International Women's Day has its roots in the worker and suffrage movement, when 15,000 women marched to New York City to demand voting rights, better pay, and fair working hours. This year marks the 105th anniversary of International Women's Day, and we are still advocating for gender equity in the workplace and home. Given that women are penalized due to outdated patriarchal structures, Women in Design advocates to empower students through three main avenues: nurturing a supportive community of care on campus, creating opportunities for students, personal and professional development, and public advocacy for systemic change towards gender equity. Our work, however, would not be possible without the Dean and key allies. We want to especially thank the following for their support in organizing this panel: Dean Mustafavi in the Dean's Office, Chantel Blakely, Public Programs Manager, who's been amazing, she's a huge asset to the GSD, Elizabeth Liao with the Asia Center, Mina Hewitt from the South Asia Institute, Teresa Lund, a dear supporter who initiated International Women's Day here at the GSD and is currently in Turkey, and of course our amazing team, Adria Boynton, Ashley Thompson, Alexandra May, Shani Carter, Chi Lin, Azura Cox, and of course all the students who have come before us. Thank you so much, and I will now turn it over to Ashley to introduce the panel.
So all of the individuals whom we're so lucky to have with us here tonight, thank you for coming, are being defined in one way or another. Each one is paving their own way, breaking molds, preconceptions, and barriers in order to bring something different and better to the practice and legacy of contemporary design and for women in design. The format for the night will start with our moderator, Susan Surface, followed by brief presentations on the work of our three speakers, as well as Susan will also present her work, which will launch a moderated round of discussion for approximately 20 minutes and will conclude by opening the floor to the audience. We very much encourage your participation and look forward to having a really robust discussion back and forth. To start, I'll briefly introduce the speakers. Dr. Atia Martin is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, responsible for the development and implementation of Boston's resilience strategy. She has a very diverse background spanning the public sector to include military service with experience in public health, emergency management, intelligence, homeland security, and she's also an educator. Next, Julia King is an architect, designer, urban researcher, and also an educator based out of the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she is currently working on the economics and space of urban migration. With significant acclaim, her design practice is concerned with housing, sanitation, infrastructure, urban planning, and participatory design in India and other developing contexts. Third, we have with us Diana Al-Hadid, who is a Syrian-born artist and sculptor now based in Brooklyn. Working with monumental sculpture, drawings, and panels to explore figuration and abstraction, she's also highly decorated and also has an upcoming solo exhibition in Abu Dhabi. And lastly, our moderator, Susan Surface, with us from Seattle, where they are program director at Design in Public. Susan is an architect, artist, organizer, educator, and researcher who's worked, just to name a few, with Super Interesting, Architecture for Humanity, the Artist Studio Affordability Project, and labs at Columbia GSAP. And these details and more in your programs. So we're so happy to have everyone with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here as we explore radical practice. So please welcome Susan.
Hi. Thank you for welcoming us all here tonight. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you, Women in Design, for inviting us all. So our intention for our time today is to share some of the thinking about how our practices are formed, informed, and perhaps even radicalized by gender, among other attributes. As the program brochure tells us, the celebration was originally a socialist movement called International Working Women's Day. It was founded in remembrance of a union strike of working-class laborers withholding their labor in order to get their needs met. Sometime after its inception, it was renamed simply International Women's Day. So on one hand, maybe a little bit of the union flavor was blanched out, but this renaming also opens up the reminder that we are not our jobs, that we have inherent value whether or not we are economically productive. So let's honor our working ancestors who started this day as we convene here at the invitation of Women in Design. around the gendered concerns of a white-collar segment of the built environment trades. And I have a few questions for us to keep in the back of our minds as we engage in tonight's conversation. Why are you here at GSD? Are you here to design buildings and spaces, to teach others how to do that, to make an impact on the disciplines of architecture, planning, policy, and art? Let's let that ground in how we share our collective wisdom. So, radical practice. A big question that I'd like to address in this conversation is that of multiple intersecting identity. What can be done in a professional capacity where you are an institutional representative, employee, or public face, alongside the times that you operate as an individual, neighbor, human, or some other relation to the actors in your world? How are you both a human and a designer, let alone a gendered human and a designer? So I'm going to show you some of the projects I've done that have helped me work through these questions. I did some of the following in the role of what we might call a leader, but mostly as a participant or collaborator. And either way, there's nothing here I could do on my own. I think of my practice of design as an operating system, where active design can result in products or they can be a way of approaching the world. That which I consider my design practice doesn't necessarily involve any kind of physical or visual object, although it could. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, which is a blue-collar industrial town about 35 miles south of Seattle, where I live today. And I love Tacoma because its most famous design is a structural failure. I think that you all have probably seen Galloping Gertie in your structures classes and maybe high school physics or something like that. As a high school senior in 1999, I went to a meeting after seeing a flyer on a pole outside in Olympia, Washington, to help put on a feminist music festival. I showed up and was this lone teenager among a bunch of actual rock stars like members of Sleater-Kinney and Bikini Kill. This is the original JPEG that was created in 1999, so it's a bit pixelated. But through organizing this event, I saw that some of my heroes were doing real grunt work, like calling sponsors and filing 501c3 paperwork. We started with $0, raised around $70,000, and eventually chose to limit corporate sponsorships intentionally as soon as we could cover the festival's actual costs. We also decided we would only do the festival once as a group, and we set up what might today be called open source replication of our name, our brand, and our process. All the meetings were public, and we put all of our notes, mistakes, and decisions online immediately as we went, and encouraged people to copy what we were doing, and they did. As of today, over 140 Lady Fests have been organized worldwide over the past 15 years. That averages about 8 to 9 a year, and they're still doing it. This year, there's some in Dayton, Ohio, Shanghai, Oslo, Manchester, Cincinnati, Brussels, maybe some others as well. When I lived in New York City and was finishing up my undergraduate degree, I was Architecture for Humanity's first employee. Cameron Sinclair, the founder, advised my undergraduate thesis project, which was a website that enabled design teams across any distance to collaborate with each other and share ideas and blueprints and so on. At the time, AFH was the first really prominent organization of its kind that was humanitarian, strong focus on design quality, and no religious affiliation. They're another instance of a propagating structure, creating affiliate chapters so autonomous groups could do local work without direct supervision. And this is happening while social media was really starting to emerge. It wasn't normal yet. And the thing that they created called the Open Architecture Network, which was also a essentially project management online platform, ran on a proprietary system. So even though the content was user-generated, it was hard to maintain, not sustainable. When tools like Dropbox and Google Drive came out, it turned out project management need was not architecture-specific. So while the website and organization unfortunately no longer exist, the thinking they helped implement in long-distance design collaboration continues. The structure was set up to let people do their own thing and resulted in hundreds or maybe even thousands of built projects. This is LA Open Acres, which is a website I designed a couple years ago in collaboration with New York City community land use activists 596 Acres, Los Angeles public health nonprofit Community Health Councils, and while working as a researcher at Columbia Sea Lab. We identified about 21,000 vacant parcels around Los Angeles and tagged them with their address, the owner's name and contact info, and how to get the land. So we provided information about that. We cleaned up a lot of disorganized data sets to convert the info into something an internet-using general public could navigate. Again, this is all open source and user-generated content, so it lets neighbors find each other. And importantly, it works with on-the-ground methods like multilingual signs on fences surrounding actual vacant lots, and a staff you can call on the phone and speak with one-on-one. So there's an infrastructure there for people who are not internet savvy to access. At the same time, my design practice addressed urban agriculture. I was competing in bull riding at amateur jackpots between Delaware, upstate New York, and Connecticut. The method I developed for this body of work I call conceptual performance documentary, where it's really important to not be an outsider or journalist coming into a subculture, even if I'm read as an outsider at first due to my gender and the way that my features are racialized. But to embody that the American West is my heritage. Half of my family are from rural northern Idaho and are really quite proudly country, and I grew up spending just as much time there as I did in cities. So as much as I photograph where I am and what is happening, I also hand the camera over to other people who are there to photograph me when I'm writing. In the midst of an environment that was obsessively urbanist, I was finding moments where rurality pushed through the city and vice versa. The research, historical and anecdotal, that accompanied the sport broke down the disparities between the rural and the urban. We know that ruralized agriculture supports urban density, but I found that rodeo showmanship owes much to urban spectators, as Texas businessmen intentionally toured the early Wild West shows to audiences in New York, Chicago, and Boston. The commercial packaging of rodeo for a genteel urban audience is actually the moment when women were excised from rough stock competition and relegated to barrel racing and pageantry. When you go to rodeos today, you might encounter folks in 9/11 Never Forget shirts. So we're finding that an event that happened in the financial center of our nation's densest square mile has actually dominated the political ideology of rural America for the past decade and a half. And even here in the Bronx, which is this photo, the Co-op City mega development rises from the site of the former Freedom Land, which was a Manifest Destiny Wild theme park, basically. There's still moments of the country in the city, whether the community garden or in this view from Pelham Bit Stables, which is just across the Bronx River from Co-op City. So keeping to New York, the Artist Studio Affordability Project was founded in 2013 by a group of artists who were kicked out of their studios by a landlord converting them to luxury rentals. I joined as an advising architect type who knew a little bit about building codes and zoning. It had a multi-pronged approach of protest and direct action, plus educating artists about policy, planning, and zoning law. ASAP also does a lot of work just reminding artists and designers that we are a type of small manufacturer, a precarious tenant, as well as a commercial entity. To that end, ASAP builds coalition with mom-and-pop businesses, tenants' rights orgs, car services, bodegas, immigrant business collections, and so on, as much as it engages in art world outreach. The current focus is advocating for something called the Small Business Job Survival Act, which would basically create commercial rent control for small businesses. ASAP's gotten multiple New York City Council members to sponsor the bill, but perhaps more importantly, it's getting the idea of organizing around policy into the toolkit of artists seeing themselves as a unified constituency. Like the small business jobs expressing itself in the form of legislation, sometimes a situation requires that instead of designing a building, the most radical approach is to change the protocol by which buildings are designed. I've been working with transgender and disability justice groups on proposing changes to the International Building Code that would expand access to all gender restrooms provided by occupancy rather than defaulting to compulsory gender segregation. Of course, requirement for segregated facilities arose in response to potty parity activism, as women entered the workforce in large numbers, only to find non-existent facilities. Similarly, the disability justice movement led to the ADA and other major transformations in the built environment. Current needs are evolving with the increased visibility of gender nonconforming and trans people, as well as changes in understanding of how real people use restrooms. We have fathers changing diapers, you have mixed gender and mixed ability couples helping each other, etc. My role in this process is that I dug through the last round of proposals to the ICC, found everyone who proposed expanding access to all gender restrooms and put them all in touch with each other. So now we are working on a coordinated approach since all of the proposals were denied in 2015, even as individual municipalities like Seattle legislate all gender restroom requirements as we did last year. The design-related initiative I've been most intensely involved with for the past year is trying to convince my county and my city to not build a building, which is the King County Youth Jail. To put it in perspective, Rem Koolhaas's Seattle Library cost $213 million in today's dollars, and its first year alone served 2.3 million patrons. It's now 11 years old, so even if you multiply that same number, it's a lot. The youth jail is budgeted at $210 million for beds up to 114 children at a time, and of course also affects their families, but many in Seattle are questioning the allocation of these funds. On Sunday, our International Women's Day celebration took place at the site of the proposed new jail. Movement leaders have been directly addressing the architecture firms and contractors who stand to earn income through designing and building this. organizers have been making the case that it is not actually feminist or equitable for local government to create jobs for women designers and local people of color in a context where youth incarceration is a form of reproductive injustice. A disproportionate ratio of Seattle's low-income youth of color are jailed and placed into foster care systems, contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline that overlapping movements like Black Lives Matter are also calling to public attention. Organizing has had quantifiable impact on what's happening. The original number of proposed jail beds was reduced by 25% to 114, down from 154. The city has revised its budget, allocating $600,000 to detention alternatives. And $2 million allocated by the Percent for the Arts program was used to create a program where children do public art instead of being sent to the juvie. And City Council has recently passed a resolution to completely end juvenile detention in Seattle. The city is currently considering denying the county its master land use permit to build, so organizers are now focusing on that. Now I'm going to talk about my day job a little bit at Design in Public, which is a strategic multidisciplinary initiative of AIA Seattle. Our mission is to celebrate the ways that design makes life better and to position Seattle as a global design leader. Now, I've stuck with design all these years because I do believe it has value, and that's why I think it's important to ask ourselves, for whom does a design make life better? What about design that makes life worse? And as an organization, we celebrate design, and we also are really into showing what's under the hood so we can make it better. We're trying to get people to think about this as we put together this year's Seattle Design Festival, which centers the topic design change. Last year, it was design for equity. We're addressing growth, transformation, gentrification, history, preservation, cultural memory, technology. I think I just made a poem altogether. This work has brought home the value of switching back and forth between designer as author and designer as collaborator. And similarly to all the other stuff that I just showed was basically open source. We accept proposals for programs and installations from anyone, not just professionals. About 14,000 people attend the festival. It's the region's largest design event. My role is to create a platform and make big picture sense of ideas that the public finds important. Technically, we don't take positions on issues, instead providing a framework for dialogue and work to happen within the civically neutral proposition of design. This is a way of treating design as a sort of United Nations where people can address difficult issues in an environment that's not a protest or a board meeting or other baggage-fraught dynamic. We make this happen through setting a deadline and bringing people together. Again, it's the idea of the content management system that allows for self-determination. Our conference at the Koolhaas Library is typically a mix of papers, hands-on workshops, kids' activities, building tours, panel talks. There are workshops for kids who are welcome at all festival events, and we aggressively publicize that breastfeeding is important at all of our events so that no one is limited from attending through the need for childcare. Our speakers range from decision makers and design luminaries, people who are very used to being entitled to leadership roles, and people who are not normally counted in that group. So this panel has on it an architect, a panelist who experienced the prison system through juvenile incarceration, community organizer, social worker, an educator, and a lawyer and law professor, all presenting and learning from each other. Our community programs, last year we had 98. Part of how we judge the festival's success is by how much of Seattle we cover. It's not all downtown artsy neighborhoods. We have events all over the place in community centers in every language you can imagine. And we're really working from the assumption that designers don't design for communities, but that designers are the community. We have shared interests around the kind of work that we do, and we're also parents, neighbors, dog walkers, and so on. Like ASAP reminds the artists, we are voters and community board attendees, whoever, and our specialized skills and interests in design have value. But every person is an expert in how they live, work, and play, so we need to think equally about what we can learn from each person we work with, as well as what we can share and contribute. So that's some of the stuff that I have done that falls into this kind of nebulous strategic creativity category. Hopefully, it can lend a broad understanding of what practice could be, but you all can decide if you think it's radical. So now I'd like to invite our presenters to share what they do. I'm really excited to learn about all of you. I think we're starting with Diana Al-Hadid, is that correct? A sculptor who makes these staggeringly intricate worlds, and then they'll be followed by Julia King, an architect currently designing large-scale water and sewer infrastructure, and Atia Martin, the Chief Resilience Officer of Boston. And these are all clearly very different practices, but they all share a publicly oriented approach, all very concerned with bringing ideas into the world. So I guess we're going to find out why we are all here together, and so I will turn it over to Diana.
Hello, thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. Is there a timer? Okay, I'm going to show you a lot of work in a short amount of time, and I'll try to wrap it into the radical practice theme. Okay, first I'm going to show you one work that I did as an undergraduate. This is a paper plate cave that I made simply by stapling paper plates together and created an installation. So all the plates are kind of attached to a wall. At the time, I was, as I said, a young undergraduate, and I didn't have really formal training with materials and tools, and the only thing I could really do was weld, and I actually wasn't very interested in kind of conventional approaches to making sculpture and thinking about objects sitting on a pedestal. I was really resistant to that. So this was the first kind of gallery work that I did, and I actually got this idea from my mother. She used to make me paper plate Halloween costumes when I was little. Was it Susan or maybe Ashley mentioned? I was born in Syria, so when we came here, my mom's version of American holidays was a little weird, I guess, let's say. So I'm going to skip through a lot of embarrassing undergraduate work and at this point, and graduate work actually. So zooming forward a few years, I've now moved to New York and started working in my studio, and without having a wall or a gallery to exhibit in, I started making more discrete objects. These are pretty large, but regardless, at this point now, I've figured out how to use a jigsaw, and I got a little more familiar with wood. Now I know mold making, I'm carving foam, doing all kinds of things. So I made that upside down cathedral, and then a series of sculptures that were all handmade. These are this is kind of like my pipe organ phase. I was really interested in these massive musical instruments that are really attached to the building. And then zooming forward again, this is a piece called Tower of Infinite Problems. This was my first more comprehensive exhibition in New York. I kind of imagined, this is based on the footprint of a labyrinth that I imagined extruding upwards into a tower, and kind of assisted by bees. You can see the theme of the title of the show referred to the Large Hadron Collider, which was first being detonated at the same month that the show opened. And I was looking here at also images of the Tower of Babel, the painting by Peter Bruegel that I was really obsessed with at the time, and making smaller work. These are kind of cousin pieces, or like a series of works based on my fascination with this painting. And it was the start of my sort of love affair with Northern and early Renaissance painters. I threw this piece in. I don't show it very often, but it's a work that I did for the Sharjah Biennial, in which it was kind of it was a really tough environment, because I don't know if biennials are just very difficult to make work for, and I ended up making a lot of this piece. This was like my fourth or fifth kind of project proposal because of things not arriving on time, yada yada. I don't know, but so I had to kind of make do with some of the materials that I had, and I ended up welding a lot of this on site, which was really interesting in the heat, the desert heat, and also being kind of like being kind of surrounded by. At one time, I lifted my helmet up and saw this the semicircle of men who had just come out of the mosque, just like, surrounding me, like, what is going on? What are you doing? It was kind of an amazing moment. Okay, so now I'm moving into figuration. I had, as you could see, this earlier work, let's call it, was made, was very architectural in nature, for lack of a better phrase, and I was avoiding figuration, and it's still a little hard to tell, but this was a kind of a woman in repose. I can't go back anyway. And here again, I'm working with the figure. Always kind of thinking about how the sculptures meet the ground, how to get them to kind of misbehave, let's say, to get them to not sit perfectly or evenly on the ground. So I don't know if you can tell, but that was a figure at the top. So this was my first solo museum exhibition. This is actually an image of it reinstalled in another space, but it was initially at the Hammer Museum, which is this space. And it was the first time that I returned to installation where the work is kind of attached to the wall, I guess proper installation, let's say. But I still didn't feel like I really got a hold of the figure in my work. So I had been working on this bronze in which I cast a woman, again, in repose, kind of, this is actually called immortal repose. So she's kind of relaxed, she's kind of basking in the sun, let's say, and she melts over the pedestal. From that piece, I felt somehow more liberated to work with pedestals, which, as you might have noticed, were always absent in my work. But here, I introduce this pedestal, and the work kind of unpacks from that core, and then it kind of opens up and disappears as you walk around the work. And then my work started to grow quite a bit more. So this piece is called Trace of a Fictional Third. Again, kind of starting with these, actually with this piece I started with these pedestals, trying to kind of not overscript the work, let's say, to kind of know not too much and work more intuitively, which was very hard for me because initially I had a lot of, I guess, like I had internalized a lot of like instructions or like what plans for how I was going to build the earlier projects, and actually the weird thing is as the work got bigger, I let myself kind of know less at the start and discover more about the project as I would build it. One more minute. Yeah, we're almost done. This is called Noli's Orders, so I'm just going to flip through a few more. So this piece was pretty pivotal for me because I learned how to build form by using these kind of floating painted drips, and then as I kind of figured out this process, I realized that I could make them into these kind of disappearing walls, these frescoes embedded in the space of the gallery. So this is a wall that you could walk around. And then I started using them more. These drips kind of like started showing up all over. I made some bronze heads because I'd never made busts before. And from those, so when I didn't have a wall to cut out, I started to make these to kind of just hang on the wall. So these are, some kind of painting. Let's say I call them panels, but so for the bronzes, I took the original busts and reworked them to make unique sculptures. Oh, I thought we were almost done. We are almost done. These are more of the panels. Okay, so this is a show at the Vienna Secession from a year and a half ago or so. This is called Phantom Limb. And this is one of the large inset panels. And this is another one that you can kind of walk through. This was last year in LA. And this is the third sculpture that I used the original head from the bronze busts. And these were just made a couple months ago. That's it.
Wow, that was incredible. Right, should I start? Great. Women in architecture are designed to be truthful is a phrase that kind of irks. When I was 17, I was in training to be a lifeguard, and one of the boys said to me, "You know, you're the fastest girl." I corrected him, and I said, "I'm actually the second fastest lifeguard." So whether you're in the "why do we need to talk about this, I just want to be good at my job" camp, or "we must do more to bring our backward profession up to the 21st century standards, it lags so embarrassingly behind" camp, or like me, you waver between the two of them. Regardless, the fact remains that women represent about 50% of students enrolled in architecture programs, but only 18% are licensed in the US. And in the UK, a recent survey has revealed that the pay gap is getting worse. This is baffling, it really is. And whilst I have this stage, I think it's baffling that the Pritzker Prize jury rejected the petition done by this very organization to give Denise Scott Brown, to give her the honor that was awarded to her partner and husband, Robert Venturi, in 1991, yet found no problem this year in awarding it to a previous jury member, another white man. But what I want to say today is to actually broaden up this conversation by asking what constitutes architecture, because it's actually a deceptively thorny question and goes a long way to articulating why we have a gender or a white male problem. I believe that buildings are a mirror to the kind of society we're trying to construct. We are surrounded by buildings, yet very few are actually designed by architects. And in socioeconomic terms, the problem is that as a discipline, we are not uncomfortable with state power and its various methods of citizen subjection because we're not critically engaged. Even architects employed in the highly polarized political situations like social housing see the role as that to creatively fulfill a design brief. And this dangerously separates the way we produce from what we produce and the world that it's in. And it really hinges on the presumption that the role of the architect is to design a building, and when the work is finished, you leave. The idea that you're somehow an expert, which is really a very neoliberal character, because you're designing buildings makes me feel very uncomfortable. However, increasingly as a profession, we are struggling to become socially, politically, and culturally relevant. I give it that. And my way to do this has been to pretty much systematically ignore the profession at almost every juncture. So this is a collage that best reflects the context in which I practice. I've always been more interested in in what I like to call the majority world or majority city, and it's not because I have some kind of Mother Teresa complex, but simply I find it more interesting than a house extension. This majority world reality happens to the backdrop of an idea of cities in terms of planners and the people in charge of them. And in this case, I'm talking about Delhi, a city I grew up in, but the same is true for most of the world. And it's done on very poor appreciations of cities like Dubai and Shanghai as appropriate metaphors, and also the worst of the architectural export, the funky glass box, which just lands devoid of context. Architecture and the global culture of capital is really perpetuated by a lot of crap renderings that play a critical role in breaking the relationship between the citizen and the city. And there's a real danger in this, and the danger is that we're missing an opportunity afforded by cities, because I firmly believe that cities are engines of growth, opportunity, hope, and social change, but if they're done well. I'm now going to relate this sort of wider sort of polemic to one of my projects, and it's in a resettlement colony on the edge of Delhi that was established in 2010. Here, previous slum dwellers were given plots of land which they had to develop as per their own means. During PhD fieldwork, I identified a key transition that was happening as the house grew vertically. These are two photographs showing the same house a year apart. And this investment has been triggered by a daughter coming of age, but in other households also from a bride entering into the family home, and is centered around the inclusion of a toilet. I then started running through a series of naive questions. So that's great. It's obviously all about toilets, but we're in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of Delhi. Where does all the shit go? And this is the answer. The shit was all collecting in pits underneath these homes that they would call septic tanks. So then I found a book on septic tanks, and I found this image, and realized that septic tanks don't work in isolation and need to outlet into some kind of treatment or sewage system. And so what was happening in Savda was that they were outletting into open grey water drains. And it was at this point that, working with a local NGO, I started to develop a project to bring sanitation to this poor and very disconnected settlement. We discussed things a lot. I drew on whiteout boards. I made pretty shitty models. I had lots of meetings like this. And the final product, the final project was essentially had 4 components: the in-house toilet, communal drains, a primary treatment in a septic tank, and secondary treatment in an upflow filter. I don't know if when I was studying architecture, I was not into this stuff. It just sort of happened. I don't know if that's kind of coming across in this talk, that I kind of stumbled into this. I had to show how the pilot project that I was proposing would work for the whole site to get government approval. So I did this drawing. And kind of miraculously, 3 years after the initial conception, back in 2014, project construction work began with this puja ceremony. This was the only lane wide enough for the digger to make it through, to dig this rather massive hole. When, this is when all the shit puns come, like, oh shit, anyway. Into which the tanks are built. And in the streets, we can lay the sewer pipes, shallow bore sewer pipes, and manholes. This man actually lives on this street. It was built into the contract for the contractor that he had to use local labor. And this is the whole system during construction. And this was it actually just last week. I've just returned from India. Because I continue working here. And an operation and maintenance team was established in which the politics of shit is turned on its head. Humiliation and victimization are turned into actual exercises of technical capacity and self-dignification. And lastly, on the back of this shared management, a residents' welfare association emerged, a legitimate political body, the first of its kind in a slum resettlement colony in Delhi. As you can see here, although the operations and maintenance team might have all been women, there is a glass ceiling, and the president was, of course, a man. I've kind of, I've whizzed through that because what I really want to leave you with is the idea of a practice of architecture that learns and imagines how marginalized groups can participate in the making of cities. I suggest that it's through this relationship between a kind of politics of incrementalism, like accretion, and other material metaphors that explain what's going on, and in this instance, the process of conducting a participatory sanitation project. Working as an architect, by doing this approach, is promising not because it promises free and inspiring designs, but precisely because it's a practice willing to get tangled up in the laws and politics and policies of everyday life. And true to such a promise, it's important to recognize the difficulty of putting in place a community-demanded shared sanitation infrastructure on the ground, and the range of obstacles, the intransigence of individual owners, the narrowness of the streets, funding and government approval. So any approach that privileges one or the other is actually missing the point. And here I end. I believe that the role of the architect goes beyond that of design, encompassing a whole range of skills, from political lobbying, community liaison, finance, and of course the traditional skills of design, development, and project delivery. And I think architects and designers are almost uniquely skilled to do this, particularly in the development sector, beyond sort of the normal stakeholders. This approach to architecture emphasizes the process as opposed to the final product. And I firmly believe that we need to see the architectural project as a social and political one beyond the building, where the intervention is often the debate itself. Susan, that was brilliant on this issue. And on that note, rounding up, why do women leave architecture? I hope that I've sort of highlighted that it's actually there are with issues within the practice as a whole. And in considering why young women are leaving, education and training should come sharply into focus. And sorry, I've just lost my point. I'd also like to mention, and this might make me a little bit unpopular, sorry, I've got a cold, that there's something to be said about being a female architect within a profession that is hyper-aware of its lack of women, because I certainly have benefited from that. Thanks very much.
Okay, good evening, everyone. There we go. Okay. So this, what I'm going to try to do is cram a whole lot of stuff in a short amount of time. So I might skip over a couple of things for the sake of time and to keep us on track. But what I want to do is just give you a sense of where we're going. So in 7 minutes, I'm going to talk about resilience, equity, responsible resilience, 100 resilient cities, and what we're doing with it in Boston. I will not take questions yet because we're then going to go into panel. So all that said, resilience. So according to 100 Resilient Cities, they say that resilience is really about this idea of how do we make sure that we're able to, as residents, as individuals within a city, as the city itself, infrastructure, all of that we're able to handle 2 different types of emergencies. One, we're used to hearing about the horrible disasters, natural disasters, terrorism, all of those things. But on the other side of that, there's the chronic stresses that we deal with in our communities. And it's these chronic stressors that are the slow-moving, constantly tearing at the fabric of our communities, things like high unemployment rates, things like racism, things like some of the low investment in infrastructure and disinvestment in communities. So these are the types of things that we see that are constantly tearing away at our infrastructure. There we go. I underestimated. There we go. So that at the end of the day is kind of the way that they frame resilience, is this idea that there's no separation between day-to-day life, both in terms of people and infrastructure and systems, as well as what happens when emergencies happen. You can kind of predict. And so this is one of my favorite quotes when it comes to thinking about when we really put resilience in practice, what we're talking about prioritizing, we're talking about making some hard decisions, and really collectively working together in order to come up with some practical solutions in order to address the challenges that we face. So when we think about equity, I'm going to go through this quickly. Let's see if you can keep up. You ready? Okay. I'm not saying anything. You have to look at this. I'm not going to read it to you. Okay? All right, equality versus equity. Well, here we go. Okay, one more, right? With the point being that equality is not the same thing as equity. And in fact, in the challenges that we face in many of our communities are based in long histories that are rooted in policies and practices that led to the inequities that we see today. And so it's not enough to give everybody equal amounts of everything because we didn't start there, right? So, so as we think about the work of resilience and we think about inequities in communities and we think about the fact that here in Boston we're focusing on people, that means that we're focusing on some of the largest inequities that we're dealing with in our communities. And consistently we see inequities from health care, from overall health status, issues around employment, issues around wealth, issues around income, violence, housing quality, whatever the challenges that we're talking about of our day, they disproportionately burden communities of color. And so it's not the most productive thing for us to talk about those issues in absence of really talking about race and racism and the challenges that we face and what we do about them in terms of advancing racial equity. So that's really the context of how we've approached the resilience strategy for the city of Boston. So what does it mean in terms of responsible resilience? So the reason why we've taken this approach is because when we think about how most people think about resilience, it's usually stuff, the environment, economy, and so this is really an approach where we're saying, what about people? And as a matter of fact, it's not just about what about people as an identification, as a missing link that is equally weighted, but in fact that people are the main weight in the way we think about the different domains of resilience. And so it's hard to talk about natural environment out of context of people. It's hard to talk about physical infrastructure out of context of people, and that there's a relationship there that we always have to stay rooted in. As we think about policy decisions, as we think about the way that we are developing programs and practices. So being that this is kind of the place that we're landing for Boston, it leads us to Boston's approach, which I pretty much have laid it out, but I haven't talked about 100 Resilient Cities, which in essence is, was started by the Rockefeller Foundation to create 100 cities across the world that have a chief resilience officer. The grant gives the city of Boston me, and that's all of it pays for. So that's been its contribution, but in addition to that, it means that we're part of a network of other cities around the world who are really trying to look at the most pressing issues in our communities, prioritizing them, and really acting as 100 beacons to other cities across the world in hopes that it sparks the same type of innovation and thinking and approaches and practices. So the timeline I have as part of this particular grant is they are really short. It's really stressful looking at that slide. And here's why. Because I was brought on in September, so from September to February, which is more than 4 months now, I've done a significant amount of engagement with community, some research with partners, convening of stakeholders, and really looking at how do we narrow the focus of this work. As I said before, resilience is about prioritizing the challenges that we face. So and we're still in phase 2, technically. That says February, it's supposed to be February, March. We kind of had to slide those timelines back a little bit. And so now we're transitioning right now into phase 2, which is really doing a deeper dive of where we can go with some of the themes that have come up, which I'll show you shortly, as well as looking at what are we going to actually put in our strategy. That is only 6 months, and then the rest of the grant is about doing. So the focus is about what are we going to be doing as the city of Boston in terms of focusing on resilience in the context of the work that we've done up to this point. So I won't read this to you. There's been a lot of meetings since September. There have been a lot of workshops, a lot of events. And so the most in-depth engagement has been the meetings and the workshops. So that gets us to just over close to 700 people that were over an hour going deep into prioritizing all of the different domains of resilience and the issues within. And so that led us to this, which I know you can't read, but it's only for illustration purposes because we don't have time to get into the details. But this is what happened with a lot of that feedback. Was to really look at where were the trends and patterns. These trends and patterns in both the engagement and what people prioritized, as well as what we were actually doing within the city of Boston, really helped to determine the scope. So this is kind of a visual representation of some of the work that's happening in the city of Boston. I know you can't read all of this, and I can't go into details, but we can talk about it later because someone will ask me questions about it, right? Right. So, and it led us here. So these are the main resilience themes that we came up with, where racial equity and social cohesion were really at the core, and really the cross-cutting theme that anchors all the other pieces. So household economic resilience is about how do we build assets in communities to address the intergenerational wealth gap. Critical infrastructure and built environment is really about not just the built environment itself, but how is it prepared to support communities, especially the most vulnerable communities in our city, where we have a lot of social vulnerability. Community and civic engagement was a huge one for folks, both in government and outside of government, and this gets us to how do we make sure that we do this better, more collaboratively, and how do we support working within communities and helping to build and develop leadership within communities that we can continue to partner with. The other piece around community psychological resilience is in two pieces. So it's really about overall mental health. What are the components of supporting mental health in communities, where there are gaps, especially in communities of color, where there's high social vulnerability, and how do we better understand, the second part is how do we better understand trauma, the root causes, and how it's impacting communities, and how we respond to it. So then there's this whole concept of resilience in all policies and practices. As we convene working groups, so each of these is a working group, really digging deeper into what specifically, because they're going to get lots of data and framing and all those pieces that we're going to do as a city, and then how do we make sure they get institutionalized, both the actual activities as well as the thinking around this. So these are some of the language that came from our resilience steering committee, as well as our racial equity working group, both very diverse groups, both in terms of expertise, race, gender, all types of factors. But these are the types of words they came up with, which are not traditionally associated with government work. So sharing my joy with you. And so really to wrap this up, one of the things that we wanted to make sure of, that our approach was really about the fact that we're taking this journey in order to create the kind of one Boston that we talk about, that we believe in, but that everyone doesn't feel a part of. So that's really the direction that we're trying to take. And I'll leave you with my favorite quote in the whole wide world. My favorite. If you can figure out who said this for real, you let me know. I've tried to research it. So the last words that I will say is, it's sad that a radical practice is trying to get people back to humanity. And so I feel privileged to be in that position, but it's also very disappointing. But what has been reassuring is the idea that so many partners and stakeholders have been willing to come to the table, who also care very deeply about these issues and have been doing this work for many, many years, both across all of those different issue areas I talked about. So that is very reassuring. So thank you very much.
Do we have to turn them on?
Just dropping pens everywhere.
And now the floor will be Susan's for about 20 minutes of moderated discussion.
So thank you all for sharing everything that you just shared. It was a really incredible breadth of things that are getting done by just a few people here. So I've prepared some questions that are the things that I always want to know when I hear someone speak. So I hope we can think of this as us just kind of gossiping in a bar with the crowd eavesdropping on us and asking questions as we go along with each other.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Where's the liquor?
It's time for that long-awaited water. Maybe I'll start with the word radical. The term refers to that which affects the fundamental nature of a thing, of being comprehensive and thorough, which I think all of you seem to demonstrate a facility with. The term has become associated with change or difference, but it might not necessarily involve a change or difference. So I'd like to hear actually from each of you what you mean by the word radical, or do you consider yourself that? So we'll start with Diana and go on down.
Okay. It's probably the first time I've ever thought of myself that way, because I don't really think about how to label myself for my work, and maybe that's a problem. I guess I've always just been responding to how other people label myself or my work. But I mean, I guess I don't know an artist that hasn't had to respond to something or react to something with passion, and maybe that is what I would call radical. I think that's kind of like a fundamental, MO for an artist, is like reacting to something that exists that you're not happy with, and that might be something deeply personal and psychological, or it might be something more openly social. But I guess I don't know. I don't know how to. It makes me a little cringy to say I'm a radical practitioner.
Yeah, we're
Although I'm here,
I'm figuring it out together.
Yeah.
So what about?
Radical.
I'm also going to do a little like time check so we can keep the thing going.
Okay, so that's my warning. She must know me. So I hadn't thought about this before, but I think just my immediate reaction is radical. The word in and of itself is just about seeing the world from a different perspective than how it's normally viewed, and doing things that are a little bit different. And maybe not even just different, but being able to try some new approaches, or just sometimes it's just tilting the axis just a little bit in a way that seems radical, but in essence, you really didn't do a whole lot. You're just like, just look at it, just take one step to the right, and you'll see kind of the world a little bit differently. And I think for me, a big part of that being radical, it is kind of weird saying it, but being radical in that context is about bringing all of yourself to everything. So for me, that's been really important, that my primary identity lies in my 5 to 9 world. Right, that's who I really am. That's kind of the world that I've built for myself, that I want and that I am in total control of, for the most part, right? But the 9 to 5 is where I bring that to in order to achieve some job that I've been tasked with, and in this case, something that I'm particularly passionate about. And so for me, that's very radical, because we oftentimes tend to partition ourselves into these different people and pretend that when we walk through the door, we're somehow different from who we are before we walk through the door. And I think it creates a lot of times a cognitive dissonance in kind of who we are and who we think we are, and getting us closer to that place. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think if we ask the question, are we or am I radical, it also needs to be appendaged with the radical to what. So if it's radical to a mainstream, then we can ask what, and let's say in the architecture profession, is there a mainstream of architectural practice? I mean, is that the house extension that I perhaps suggested it is? And I think that's increasingly up for debate. If I bring up my mention of Aravena, Alejandro Aravena, who's just won the Pritzker Prize, I'm pretty sure he didn't win it for his mainstream architecture. I'm pretty sure he won it for his 2,500 social housing units, which pisses me off, because there's architects like Yasmin out there who've built 45,000. So, and she's radical, I think. And so then, so I'm kind of going, maybe I'm radical if the mainstream is architecture, it's a building, because most of my buildings aren't buildings, they're sewers. So that is radical if we say that that's not architecture. Now I'm sort of suggesting that maybe it's becoming increasingly mainstream to do the other stuff, given that Aravena has just won this award. I'm going to stop there, but just some thoughts.
I was really interested in what you said about focusing on the process versus the end result. And I might push back on that a little and say that I think that actually really does have a lot of value to focus on what is made. And we see evidence of that in work like yours, where, on one hand, it can be very tricky to just focus on the end object. But on the other hand, when you are making specific things that are so rich and fascinating, it's really incredible. And that leads me actually to a question that's a bit specific to you. Is I think that maybe in our framework, the role of collaboration and working with other people or institutions or systems is pretty clear. I'm curious as to a bit about how that might work for you. Like, are you making these things yourself or assistants, or how does that go?
I do have assistants, but I make them it's my work. So I don't think of it as a collaboration, because they get paid. So I can't, but at the same time, like, of course, it's a small crew and it changes depending on the project, but of course, like, they have an intimate knowledge and relationship with the work, so I'm always interested in what they have to say in terms of, like, suggesting, oh, maybe if we made this cut here, it'd get out the door easier, or something like that. But they don't often, or maybe ever, offer kind of content or critical advice or anything.
Really intense to carry all the weight of like being responsible for bringing these things into the world.
I mean, I grew into it, so it's not, not like one day.
Okay, so earlier you said no one ever asks like really hard questions on the panel, so I'm gonna ask one that might be hard or easy depending on you, and I'm gonna start with you.
I didn't say that.
No, Julia said that. Okay, think about, and this is, you can all be thinking about it because it might move to you, but think about how much money you earn or the resources you have access to. What is your income? What do you have in your bank account? And who or what can you call on for support? Now, if you'd rather not name numbers, because there's so much stigma around that, and this is going on YouTube forever, do your means allow you to sufficiently take care of yourself and your people? This means financially and emotionally, without having to choose between the necessities you can provide.
I'm happy to answer this question because I think it's really important to do it. And I think when I started out doing this kind of work, I was actually living out of a suitcase. I didn't have a home. And sorry, this is coming off really deep, and I'm about to start crying. It's not. So I genuinely have a cold. And it was actually, and that kind of mobility afforded me to live off not very much money, and also I was on a kind of academic scholarship in pounds, and when the pound is doing well, that goes a long way in other countries, and. A real struggle that I've had is, after a while I was like, this fucking sucks. I was, couldn't hold down a relationship, and after a while, when you're sleeping in a cement factory in some godforsaken room by yourself, having traveled for 25 hours, it just stops being fun. And so when I went back to the UK, I really wanted to, and I also, one thing, I never wanted to do this kind of work subsidized by another kind of work. I always thought, what, if that's going to end up being how I operate, I'm just going to pack it all in and go become, and be something that makes money and just fucking make money. And how I've reconciled that is, and actually, but there's other uses for that, but I'll just talk about it in the context of money, is to be a part-time academic where I write about the work that I do, and also do other projects. So at LSE, I'm a consultant, effectively, on issues urban. On some projects are bad, but I use that as a kind of chink in my armor to sharpen what I think is good. And then that also helps fund my time to do other projects, because one of the tricky things for this kind of work isn't necessarily the funding for the project. That's actually quite easy to find. What's difficult to find is someone to fund your time to think about it. And
one of the other questions I'd prepared was, have you ever had to have a job in order to afford the job you really want to have?
So that was what I kind of answered, and that's a no. And my brief little stint into CS, corporate social responsibility money, I didn't want to do because the client then had too much say over the kind of project. And there was a project particularly in the top of my mind where I was almost having to educate the client because they had the wrong project in mind and I knew it, but they were paying me to do project A when actually I was trying to say, guys, we've got to do project B, but that didn't happen. So in a way, I'm trying to use academia to not only develop my practice and help me fund my time, but to also where research funds my time, my front-end time for those type of projects. I'm not rich, and I don't earn a lot of money, but that's okay.
Anybody else want to take that one on?
Sure.
Anybody?
Yes. I'll give it a shot.
Hoping you would say that.
So the question about income, I am a government employee, so I could be making a lot more money not doing what I'm doing. However, I think the sacrifice, which really isn't a huge sacrifice considering there are folks who are struggling, with 2, 3, 4 jobs trying to make ends meet to support their family. And at one point that was me and my husband. So this place I'm in right now is actually, I feel like, is a huge place of privilege. So the fact that I can work one job and my husband can work one job and we can pay our bills and support our family, it's still a juggling act, but we can do it. When I first came home from the military, so first of all, I grew up poor. I grew up here in Boston. We moved every 2 to 3 years, and so there wasn't a lot of housing stability. And when I left to go to I left to go to school first, then the military. When I came home, I was waiting for my job with the FBI, which was a low-paying job. And I had to get up at 3:45 in the morning to go deliver papers out of a warehouse. And there were hundreds of them. I had a whole neighborhood to cover. And then I would come home and get kids ready and get myself ready and drop them off and go to a temp job and do that for 8 hours and then go pick up kids. And so it's those types of struggles that are very real in a lot of people's lives. And for me, one of the questions you asked about, do you have the type of support that you need? And so I didn't always have that type of support, and really it was, I spent most of my life not having that type of support until I met my husband. And then kind of being able to have someone to kind of really work towards a similar goal together that kind of saw the world a lot closer to the way that you see the world, or at least the way I see the world, was really important, and who always had my back and was always supportive, and being there when times got really hard, to be able to kind of remind me of who I am and keep me grounded, because the road has been long and hard, and I think having a social network that really has your best intentions at heart is really critical to being able to keep pushing through. Sometimes I think I was watching, one of those Netflix original series, I think the political one, what is that called? House of Cards. Thank you. House of Cards. That's how my memory works. All the details, alphabet game, and then eventually the words come. But House of Cards, and one of the things that the main character said, whose name I'm not going to remember, but you all know it, that guy.
Frank Underwood.
Frank Underwood. Him. He said it. So she watches the show more than I do. But the few episodes I saw, the one thing that he said that I thought was fascinating was he said, the higher up the mountain you go, the more treacherous the journey. And so I feel like as part of this, the journey has been long and hard, but it also, as I get kind of closer to having to take on such big roles, that it has been more challenging in a different way than it was before. But I'm going to be quiet because I feel like I've been talking for a while.
I'm happy to speak about this.
Also, we have like 5 left, so we're going to try to
5.
cut in at least one more question. 5
I
minutes.
can skip.
No, go on.
Okay. I think I'm very fortunate now. So I think most of America would probably consider me rich because I'm a business owner and I employ people. So I have enough money to provide for others. But it didn't start off that way. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what people consider really rich, but truly from where I first started, that sounds really weird, but I'm being honest. Like, if I can employ people, I think I'm in a good position, right? So I didn't start off that way. I think a lot of people think it's always been that way. Like, I got out of school and I just brought people in and started, paying people. But I had my own, I guess, long stint of living out of a suitcase and relying on grants and bouncing from, couch to friend's house to dog sitting to, art handling jobs to temp jobs and whatever, just making little pieces, putting little pieces together. But, I didn't have children. I do now. I didn't have anyone else to support, and I knew that early time was crucial. So I also, I really believe that everyone has some advantage, no matter how small, if they examine their life closely. And mine was that my brother was living in New York, and I could stay on his futon for a few months here and there. So there are ways to survive in New York if you kind of examine, I know I have a friend, and some people have way bigger advantages. But that was my tip, I guess. I avoided paying rent except for on my studio for a really long time, and I had the worst studio to start out with, like no ventilation, no natural light, one really questionable toilet in the corner, no heat, so. And now you can see images of my studio and my wonderful team, but at the same time. I sell my work is sold through a gallery, and I'm really fortunate to be in a good moment. But the art world is really fickle, and it's not like a guaranteed salary. So it just depends on sales and frequency, and how much you can work. And but that it goes up and down, and there's really no there's no guarantee, let's say, but. For the first time in the past few years, I got my own health insurance. Like, that was a big moment, little things like that, which actually it's a big thing.
We have the NHS.
You have what?
NHS.
We have the NHS, thank God.
Yeah. So, it's been a long process, but I feel like I'm in a good spot, and it was mostly thanks to having working with a gallery that's got my back. And again, it has a lot to do with your support network. Like, I count my gallery as one of my support networks, and my friends and my husband, and so that all factors in. But I don't have anything to complain about now. I know how lucky I am, because I know what it's like to not have it. So.
Really crucial. So we have a couple minutes left, and before I ask another question, I was wondering if you have any questions for each other.
Either bring it out to the floor.
Bring it out to the floor.
Unless you
Did I say questions? You.
Yes, me.
Fuzzy scarf.
Thank you. My question is, today a lot of you.
Also, I was going to say, when you ask a question, it'd be awesome if you could introduce yourself by name and if you're directing it to a certain person.
Okay. My name is Chi-Chi Lin. I study real estate, but I was an architect. So my question is that each of you have presented your work, and most of it is based on your, I would say, 9 to 5. I know as designers and people lecturing in the design school, your work really defines who you are, but that might be just one chapter in your long career. So what is it that you really want to get out of your career? What is the goal that you're working towards, or what's the mission that you're working towards, the major arc? And that's for everyone.
I'll go for it. I actually had a question here that kind of speaks to that about the glass ceiling, which is a spatial metaphor to describe systems that prevent women and gendered people and racialized people, poor people from ascending this corporate career ladder. And so the term implies that people who wish to shatter that ceiling are all in the same building to start with. And I would say I would like to think of myself as not entirely being in the building, where I'm not looking to get anything particular out of a career. That's not my end game. It sounds so West Coast, and I'm showing my roots, but I kind of just want to live a life and be in a community with people. And so I find myself doing all of this stuff. As Atiya said, it's a pretty nasty situation that we have to turn to radicalism in order to restore our humanity, but that's really, I think, what I'm trying to do. And a career is, one way that we all engage in capitalism, or some of us, I can't say that we all do. It's one way that I engage in capitalism, but it's not my main point in life.
Go ahead.
I'd probably say, so the main question about what the ultimate goal of my career is, right? That's the main question, is that correct?
Doesn't necessarily have to be work. Work could just be one chapter of what your main goal is.
Okay. So my main ultimate goal, and I'm very transparent about this, is my family. So family first. In our house, we call it last name first. And then in making sure that our children, number one, have the tools, skills, and access to resources to be able to thrive and not just survive in this world, especially in the context of this being a very racialized world that is not built for their success without a lot of extra. And so that's always my end game, is about legacy, is about family, and it's about making sure that at the end of the day, there isn't any harm done to my family, but more importantly, that there's the type of progress that I'm trying to shift from my pattern of my family. And so first person in my family to graduate from college. So those types of trends, kind of growing up very poor. And then the second part is making sure that the work that I'm doing supports my community. And I define my community in a lot of different ways, because I'm part of a lot of different communities. And so making sure that how I approach this work is inclusive, that voices are heard when they're not normally heard, and that the way that that I am able to control, that we approach the work is about communities being able to benefit from this. And then the last piece is about overall that we're able to, I brought up the word humanity earlier, that we're able to remove a lot of the barriers to humanity. And one of the biggest barriers right now that we have to humanity is race and racism. And what I mean by that is people see race before they see things that are more important, like that's a child, right? So you see race before you see a child. We see race before we see an elderly person. We see race before all of these things that would normally give us pause. And it's also a huge barrier to our ability to make the type of real human interactions that create relationships and expand our social networks. And that we know from research, no matter what issue, so I talked about all those inequities, no matter which type of inequity that we talk about, one of the consistent things that the literature shows is that social connections are one of the biggest protective factors against those things, and not just social connections individual to individual or community to community, but also community to institutions, so the way that communities can engage with government and navigate systems that are supposed to support them. So for me, that's kind of my bigger picture, much larger picture perspective.
The risk of sounding like a complete megalomaniac, I think my honest answer would probably be, and I've probably felt this for quite a long time, that that at the end, that perhaps my work, particularly because my personal life is fine, is, that's just ongoing. I think with work, the ambition would be that it would have consequence beyond myself and meaning beyond myself. That it's contributing to some kind of greater good, which is quite a broad ambition, but I also think it's very ambitious.
It is. It's a very ambitious question. Am I cutting you off?
No, that was, yeah.
Felt like and I have to, I wish I could take their answers and also say that, because they're beautiful and eloquent, and I agree that now I think about my baby and his welfare, and would love for my work to have contribute to a greater good, but I honestly don't plan too far past like a couple years, and that I mean, maybe I'm just not used to that yet, but I'm still in the mode where I just kind of want to avoid having a day job or like some other. I want to just keep being allowed to make my work without needing something else to support it. And that's
so
my
true. That's
biggest,
absolutely where I'm at. Like
yeah,
in 6 months,
that's
I have
it.
no clue what I'm doing.
So my big dreams is like not to have to go back and work in an office or something.
And like a deep advanced planner.
Yes, every life decision has been to avoid this kind of trudgery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be nice to not be a renter one day, but it's really hard to save.
Questions?
Thank you. On a similar note to what you just said, Julia, in your talk you were saying that one of the ways in your career that you found to kind of subvert the status quo is to just ignore it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that and the choice that went into that, and then also how you see it playing out.
So I just sort of kind of went and very happily was kind of hanging out in Delhi and, interested in sewers and stuff. And I wasn't too terribly worried about whether this was architecture or getting my part 3 or any of those kind of questions, which perhaps was me just sort of ignoring it. And it was actually really interesting for me personally because just when I had even stopped, I actually was like, oh, maybe I should call myself, when people ask me, what do you do, say, oh, like development. I then, out of nowhere, was awarded Emerging Women Architect of the Year in the UK. And so it was almost like the profession, and that was for me a kind of a revelatory moment. And when I realized that, oh, I have huge currency in operating as an architect in this field. And it was almost like, so I have a sort of odd relationship with it because I am very critical of the profession, but also I'm very grateful because the mainstream definitely embraced me and actually helped formulate a lot of the ideas that, that I think about. And so, yeah, did that answer your question? I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah. So yeah, it was very, yeah, I was trying to ignore it, and I still think I sort of do. I work at the LSE. It's like I'm the only architect there, and yeah, so I'm not incredibly bothered about, kind of if I'm ever gonna. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more before we release you from the basement?
Can I just comment on your question? I feel like I'm in a similar position where I get asked very regularly about, my biography and my identity as an immigrant, as a Syrian American, and how that affects my work, and how, the very personal questions, like very deeply psychological questions that are sometimes very near impossible to answer. And I remember really resisting that when I was an undergrad, kind of not wanting to make like overtly political work because I didn't want to be like pigeonholed, and I guess I always try to explain to people, and most of you here are in the audience are women may identify with this. Like of course, I'm used to the fact that I'm a woman. Like I'm used to the fact that I'm who I am, an Arab and, you know, a Midwestern. I grew up in the Midwest. So I was always kind of shocked, or I became shocked when my work became more public about just to have to answer those questions, or to kind of see how people viewed me and how it was kind of summarized in the press and for sound bites and whatnot. So I guess for me, I ignore the status quo, or that by just pursuing the work that I'm interested in and continuing to be curious about and trying to be very genuine about what I'm curious about, and not trying to kind of you know, answer to you know, or try to be like a representative, or I mean, I guess I in some ways represent something. Like you know, I guess I'm became slowly aware of the novelty of my particular biography, because I also realized at some point that I didn't know a lot of other Syrian women sculptors my age who grew up in Ohio. So, you know, like I was like, yeah, that is kind of novel. You know, I was, you know, eventually realized that the rest of the world was like, well, that's peculiar. How did you get to be where you are? And I thought, yeah, that is kind of peculiar. I'd like to meet more people like that. And I have here and there, but it's interesting because every time I do a show or exhibit my work in the Middle East, I get a lot more questions about my biography and about kind of how did I get to be where I'm at now. But I forget about it most days because I'm just worrying about, like, you know, getting my shoes on, getting out the door, and, you know, like other practical things. But it is a really, it's something that I kind of have to like accept and stop ignoring, because in part two, I think I've also earned a lot of grants because of the novelty of my particular biography. And that's not I mean, you know, now I've come to appreciate it. Like, okay, well, that is weird. Like, I am, you know, fit a lot of strange answer.
I sort of want to add on to that too, because I often feel very sort of, you know, actually being a woman in the areas that I work in is incredibly helpful. You know, there's a softness to one's femininity that, as I said, it's incredibly helpful when you're working in quite charged and contested areas, and when, to be fair, the kind of the white man in khaki shorts is really not welcome, and so I'm actually Venezuelan, and my mom still lives in Caracas, and I kind of very much embrace I'm from the third world too. I'm a woman, softly, gentle approach, and I use it, and I know I'm doing it, and so sometimes I have to wonder. I'm like, fuck, I'm a fraud, you know, because like, you know, if I was a man, I wouldn't get away with what I get away with, or I wouldn't, you know, be invited to, you know, I've traveled the world like doing talks and stuff, and so. It's a funny one, and I kind of I always go, I think it's great that I'm a woman, you know.
So I guess one of the things I'll add to that, I'll say you're not a fraud, and it's what anyone does is develop relationships with other people, and so you figure out ways to identify with another person, and you're in situations where it benefits you to be a woman, to be able to connect with other people in your background and your narrative, and I think that for a lot of us, that's not always the case, right? Where if you're in kind of the American context, and I walk into a lot of rooms and I'm the only, right? Like out of like 10 different ways you can identify a person, like I'm the only one of those things in the room. And so it becomes one of those things where I don't necessarily think that I ignore that piece, but I think at the end of the day, it's not how I approach the work. I approach the work as someone who is trying to do the best work and is trying to support communities in the best way I can with the resources I have access to. And I think when that is always the focus, then it's less likely that you're going to fall into those other traps of, am I being a woman enough? Am I being black enough? Am I being this enough? It's like, well, I'm just a Tia and I'm me, and this is what you get, and that's all there is to it. And I think there's something liberating about that allows makes it easier to navigate through kind of those different spaces. And then the last thing I'll say is, and I think, I mentioned earlier kind of the challenges of being a person of color living in a world that's so racialized. And I think being aware of that is important. I think when we walk through the world, regardless of what race we are, not recognizing that, we're likely to perpetuate things that we don't intend, but we do because we're not kind of being upfront and being clear about the way the world is actually structured and in the full context of the world. So that's one of the things that we've made sure we've taught our children is to understand kind of who they are and all the strengths that they bring to the table in their history and their heritage so that they can go out into the world with the type of confidence and strength that it takes to be successful. And then the last thing that I'm going to say is another quote I actually heard this weekend. I was in D.C. at the National League of Cities at a race, equity, and leadership conference. And a young man gave an amazing speech that I don't have time to get into. But in essence, he said there's a quote in his school. And the quote says, "Thou shalt not be a victim. Thou shalt not be a perpetrator. But above all else, thou shalt not be a bystander." And for me, that was incredibly powerful. And so it's something that we've said to our children in other ways, but I think in the context of navigating the treacherous waters of that is society, like that those are the types of things that all of us should live to keep in the forefront of our minds.
I think it's pretty good, especially in terms of our time. And maybe I would add just one more thing to that, where I think that what you were sort of maybe calling fraud, I would call code switching or translation, where I've found it pretty useful to, on one hand, I can sit on a panel at Harvard's architecture school, and then I can leave this room and suddenly become nothing more than buttocks that someone can comment upon on the street. So, some people think that I'm 17 years old, and other people know that I'm 34. There's like lots of ways that we can carry ourselves or use our identities in order to facilitate a certain type of reaction. Unless you have anything else to say, I would really just like to thank all of you for being here and for making it possible for us to be here. So I would definitely like to call attention to the Women in Design event organizers, the administration and faculty here, the people who built this building and who clean and care for it every day. Because we would not have this building if we did not have everyone who worked in it. And of course, the Native and First Nations communities whose land we are currently on. We really rely on everyone. I think that's a common theme that we've had tonight, is that we rely on everyone who makes our processes and outcomes possible. So we don't work alone, and we are all in this together. And I hope that you will come talk to us. I think that there's supposed to be a reception somewhere nearby right about now. So thank you.
Sorry. I just want to thank you all for coming again, and thank you to the speakers. I just want to acknowledge that this is the first time I've been here that people acknowledge their families, and we are laborers, and we work, and we are architects designing really beautiful, amazing things. But there's just a lot that we can still unpack, and I think, Tia, you mentioned restoring humanity. That could be considered radical practice, and I think we were a little, provocative in the title on purpose, trying to unpack what it really means and how, just to really question how we are practicing as designers and as humans. Thank you so much for coming again. Thank you.